On today's World Insight, Asia's worst currency crisis before the turn of the century that grew into a global financial meltdown. 25 years on, after the 1997 financial crisis, have emerging economies learned to better deal with systemic risks? Is the world still facing these risks today?
Systemic change in the international financial system have very long-term consequences.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Asian financial crisis. The lessons of the crisis is still relevant today. Yet things are becoming arguably even more complicated, with geopolitics, new technologies, and a world with huge deficit of trust. And you really need to hear the thoughts of our panelists today as they reflect upon what happened 25 years ago and analyze the dangers we are facing today. On the 25th anniversary of the Asian financial crisis, I'm joined in Singapore, Jim Rogers, chairman at Rogers Holding. Good to see you, Jim. In Singapore, also, Bert Hoffman, director of the East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore, former country director for China of the World Bank. In Washington, D.C., William Lee, chief economist of the Milken Institute. Last but not least, in Beijing, Xu Qiang, assistant director from the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is a huge topic, and it was a huge lesson to be learned. From every one of you, to begin with, very briefly, what do you think should be the most important lessons learned? Let's start with Professor Hoffman.
When it happened, I was a young economist in Washington, and frankly, it was very hard to wrap our brains around what was actually happening. But I think the real big lesson is that systemic change in the international financial system have very long-term consequences. And what I mean with that is that really the 1997 Asia financial crisis was the crisis that followed the 1972 abandonment of Bretton Woods. And the mobility of capital as a result, and that surged in the 90s, that was a key element in the Asia financial crisis. Many more factors, but that's the one thing I take away.
The breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and the search for investment opportunities of capitals casually. Let's go to Professor Xu Qiang. Mr. Xu.
Asian countries have developed so fast in the year of the 1980s and 1990s, early 1990s, and that was a golden era. But people just get crazy about the economic growth, that is irrational exuberance, and people have been borrowing too much of a foreign debt, loan interest foreign debt. And then this foreign debt has caused the collapsing of everything in those tigers. And I think that was really be a lesson really worth to be learned in after era. For example, in Sri Lanka later, and also China and Korea, and many other emerging markets have been learned the lessons. It's been benefiting us.
So it is foreign debt you're talking about. Let's go to Mr. Lee.
One of the things that we've learned since that time is the importance of containing financial crises and what it takes to contain a financial crisis. But what makes a crisis in one country spread to another, the contagion effect, are vulnerabilities in transmission. That is, countries don't have the adequate financial infrastructure to handle inflows and outflows of capital, and don't have the regulatory environment to have transparency to show where distortions are so that we can address them. One of the things that we have to we have learned since then is to improve the strength of the financial infrastructure, improve the regulatory system, improve transparency.
Financial governance structure within economies themselves. Very interesting. Let's last go to Mr. Rogers. You were an investor then.
I was an investor then, and like the professor, I was very young then. I hope I'm still very young, but no. One of the things you asked, what lesson? The main lesson, history has shown many times, do not borrow short and lend long. And that's what many people were doing in Asia. They were taking in deposits and lending them out at a longer term. I happened to be short at that time, and I had sold the Hong Kong dollar short because I could see and other people could see this was madness. There was an unbelievable debt frenzy going on in Asia at the time.
Very interesting. So all of you coming from very different perspectives. Tom talk about, financial structures within economies and across economies. Others talk about, investment principles, that is, not to build your prosperity based on debt. Of course, there's also, very importantly, the international financial governance system, such as the Bretton Woods and others. Now, skipping 25 years, let's take a look back at what happened. Mr. Hoffman, it started from the pegged Thailand currency to the US dollar, and it spreads to other economies in Southeast Asia, and later, of course, in South Korea as well. Some suggest it says something about the pegged exchange rate, but how much role is it really that factor is playing? Or rather, it is a factor that is playing with the bigger context of governance system and also risky money?
Well, look, the exchange rate system was incredibly important for Thailand and for many other Southeast Asians. And basically, they held on to the fixed exchange rate system as was prevailing under Bretton Woods. But that was very incompatible with the free flow of capital. When people stopped believing in whether the Thai could still pay back, they ran out of international reserves. The policy was to first not adjust, but to finance that capital flight that was really going on since 1996. And then suddenly Thailand was out of reserve. That caused a crisis. And then investors, but also others, looked around the region and said, well, who else looks like this? Sort of like this. And that was this contagion effect that William Lee is talking about. So this holding on to an exchange rate system that was no longer fit for the external environment was probably a key factor. Malaysia took the solution to, in a way, go back and impose capital controls. And having a fixed exchange rate system and capital controls, that is consistent. So, but a lot of the other countries, they ended up with an inconsistent system.
Mr. Lee, same question.
I would expand what Bart just said and say that any exchange rate system can be made to work if you follow the rules. Unfortunately, in Asia, the rules for a fixed exchange rate system were violated all over the place because governments were running huge deficits. There was huge structural domestic imbalances, so that capital that flowed across countries flowed in a very violent sort of way. So I think the lesson to be learned would be, if you have a fixed exchange rate system, you have to operate within the rules of a fixed exchange rate system. If you go to a flexible exchange rate system, that doesn't free up your ability to do anything you want. It just changes the rules.
You don't think there's also much danger today of similar things happen, even though it could be different in details?
In fact, the danger is even greater today because technology has made the speed of the transfers much faster and the volumes of transfers are much greater. Unfortunately, the transparency of where the flows are originating, especially when you start to consider the crypto world, the transparency is certainly much to be desired. So the similar problems that caused the Asian crisis are looming around today. In other words, lack of transparency and lack of disclosure.
Mr. Chu, your thoughts?
I believe there was a lot of lessons to learn at that time. For example, at that time, we're just graduated from Bretton Woods systems collapsing, and they're still being saying that you should have a freely floating exchange rate system. You need to have a free rhyme about it. But at that time, a lot of people are not aware about this, can be very dangerous. And also, people are not paying too much attention about foreign reserve. People are saying that you can do whatever you want because this is a free market. We need to embrace a liberal trading system and et cetera, and a financial system. And people In Thailand and Malaysia, they don't have enough foreign reserve, and that causes a problem. And that lessons are all be learned at later era. Just take a look at right now. Recently, even though we're experiencing recession internationally, huge inflation, I think 1997 crisis, they did have given those countries the opportunity to learn, and some countries in Singapore, you see their exchange rate are really stable. They're performing like a benchmark in a region. So I think after all, this can be a good thing after 10 or 25 years.
Mr. Rogers, how will these economies, economies of this size, be able to protect themselves to a certain extent, not only from the hot money, hot capital, but also from the ill teachings of others, even though they could sound beautiful?
Well, that's a very good question. As I said, history has shown a lot of these lessons, but governments don't learn the lessons of history often. One of the main lessons of history, Tianwei, is people do not learn the lessons of history. We recently had a president in the US who had no clue about history. He thought he was smarter than history. History's smarter than all of us. But back to what was said before, Professor Hoffman said that people learned their lesson. No, Malaysia did not. Malaysia instituted fixed exchange rates and rigid capital flows, which made Malaysia fall behind all the other Asian countries for a while. If you ask me, the main lesson is you have to have flexible systems without strict rules, because many investors have learned throughout history that if there is a fixed target, they can shoot at that target and maybe they will make some money, because if you bet against central banks, you nearly always come out ahead throughout history, because they have these strange rules, strange targets, strange fixed rates, which when things are going wrong, a fixed rate cannot hold.
On the other hand, Mr. Rogers, how will these smaller economies, even though grow with very much aspiration, be able to protect themselves and less vulnerable to the turbulences, whether it's created by themselves or by others, bigger economies?
I live in Singapore, which is a small country with only 5.5 million people. And Singapore, throughout its last 50 years or so, has been very flexible. It has done well. It has not run up huge debts. History is pretty clear. If you run up huge debts, Tianwei, you're going to have problems eventually, especially if you have rigid fixed exchange rates. These are such simple lessons that have been going on for hundreds of years.
But one could say the U.S. has the biggest debt in the world.
I didn't mean that as a compliment to the U.S. The U.S. is going to have staggering problems. The U.S., I'm an American citizen, by the way, but the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. Anyway, that's going to lead to huge problems. It may start in the U.S. because there is such staggering debt, but it could start in Japan. It could start in many places.
This is World Insight. We'll be back after this.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tianwei go beyond the headlines.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. This is World Insight. Our topic, Asian financial crisis 25 years ago. What does it mean for us today? Mr. Lee, let me go to you on that thought. How can smaller economies, even grow with quiet aspirations, be able to protect themselves under very different circumstances? One could argue we are in another important juncture.
Let me give you an example of advice that the IMF gives to almost every country, which is to have a very diversified financial system, a financial system that is has many different players in it, different institutions, banks, stock markets, bond markets. Now, unfortunately, when you come to reality, countries in Asia that are small and open economies, you can't have a very diversified financial system because you don't have the kind of depth and liquidity to support these financial systems. So the regional cooperation and the coordination of the capital flows across a region, I think it would be one way that you can take and adapt them to the region and the specific circumstances of a country and an area.
Is that possible regionally, Professor Hoffman?
Well, I mean, in a way, you have seen this already. Then you've also seen regional cooperation in the Chiang Mai Initiative or the Chiang Mai Multilateralization Initiative. So where you see also a regional, if you want, insurance against some of the crises that we have seen.
But one could argue, Professor, if I could, now geopolitics are making things very complicated.
Regional solutions therefore become probably even more prominent. Europe has also found a regional solution for supporting its countries, in addition, if you want, to the IMF. The IMF as a global institution may be a bit more bound of these geopolitical constraints going forward. But of course, we all still need the IMF. I disagree with Jim Rogers on that. I think there is a role for an organization that if you want, give some standards, give some policy advice to countries that run into trouble, give some financing to countries that run into trouble. That's a useful organization. But indeed, with geopolitics, maybe the regional solutions become more prominent.
Mr. Chu.
Well, I think for the small economies to protect themselves, when I've been working in research with the Central Bank of China, we did find some very beneficial points. For example, first of all, as a small economy, you really need to be very careful about your own situation. Don't be lured by or frightened by the external factors. For example, when they say you need to open up your capital account, just to be aware of your own situation and your own reality. And second, be very, very aware of the debt. Foreign debt is going to kill you. And also a lot of people are saying internal debt or domestic debt is not a problem. But then can be a problem recently, been proved in evidence in America, well, and in Europe and in Japan. Domestic debt can cause the traps in your own country. And also always try to be very, very careful about your own fiscal and financial principles. And you need to be disciplined. Don't borrow too much money. Don't spend too much money. And you really need to keep a certain amount of foreign reserve. Just look at the latest instructions of the IMF. They've been saying, okay, in order to going through this financial crisis, you need to have enough foreign reserve. Simple as that. And also, I think Bill just mentioned a very important point in here.
Mr. Lee, what is your understanding about how economies better protect themselves when now, for example, the U.S. side is trying to work on its policies, both for the global economy, its own economy, and also for its competition, if not rivalry, against China? So how much complicated layer is there for other economies to take into consideration, whether looking at the U.S. or the global financial institutions' directions or advice?
Well, economic principles are always important, but geopolitics is something that will shape the way the economic principles are applied and rules and regulations are put together. In today's world, where we have China and the US as being these two largest economies of the world, getting the framework for the two countries to interact, trade, financial flows, listing requirements, how the two interact together will set the stage for the rest of the world. If we are successful in being able to have China and US be able to interact with each other effectively, then the rest of the world will be able to do that. If we can't do that, that's when we start breaking up into regional fiefdoms. And that's where a lot of inefficiencies can arise and where opportunities for Jim Rogers will really arise for him to exploit the kind of regionalism that comes out of failed geopolitics. So to me, the real imperative is get the framework between China and US correct, and everybody else will flow naturally. But if we don't do that, then the opportunities and distortions arise.
Mr. Rogers, your name is being mentioned.
Well, Mr. Lee, thank you for mentioning me. But the problem, as I see the world right now, is the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in history, and it's getting worse and worse every day. And at the same time, China, the second largest economy in the world, has fixed exchange rates and capital controls. That cannot be good for the world. History shows that. Now, China's done a brilliant job over the past 40 years, but somebody has to have some flexibility in the system, or this is all going to clash. Japan has got staggering debt. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the world, there are problems developing. And to repeat, Kenway, you're going to have a lot of business, a lot to report on in the next few years.
You see, the economies are trying to protect their own interests first, of course. That's only natural. You see, the U.S. is making great use of the U.S. dollar as the global currency and to protect its own economy. Of course, it also serves its a public role to a certain extent. Well, China, with this bigger context of geopolitics, it's trying very hard to protect its own economy now. So, Mr. Chu, how do you see these two economies trying to make of use what they have to protect their own interests first? And how do you see their relations in this regard? What does that mean for the other economies? This is a huge topic, but I want to give a whole, description of the picture. Please, Mr. Chu.
Well, fortunately, yes, that's my latest research for what it's about. Yes, I think Bill mentioned a very important point. We do have a very new situation. Economic principle is important, but geopolitics can really warp the situation, the whole process. China and the U.S. used to form a unified system globally. U.S. trying to give the whole world the cheapest financial resources, while China has been providing the cheapest labor resources and other productivities. But right now, technology has been facing a top, and without the improved productivity, so everybody are not making the bigger cake. They need to split the cake. So right now, the unification of the whole world has been falling apart. Everybody need to look out for their own profit. And probably everybody are familiar with the term of the Triffin dilemma. And America basically are just looking out for their own profit, and they've been hitting the Triffin dilemma. And China, to some extent, has been facing the same situation. So now the whole world is like everybody for their own good.
Mr. Lee.
Well, I agree that every country has to develop its own economies and be able to be as productive as possible. But one of the benefits of trade is that you can actually live beyond your resource constraints. Geopolitics will step in and distort how the trade is conducted, where the trade's conducted, but ultimately, we all have to start trading with the rest of the world. No country can live as itself in an island.
What are those policies? Probably that is the key answer I want to get from you.
It's going to be a rebalancing of specialization and safety and security. That is, in other words, global supply chains have been very stretched out and very, very specialized in different regions of the world. But now I think we've learned our lesson from COVID that we cannot allow these supply chains to become so stretched and so fragile. And that, I think that's one of the lessons that we have tried to redevelop in policies to regionalize the supply chains and nationalize supply chains.
Mr. Hoffman, Professor.
Well, look, you mentioned before on the use of the dollar in a geopolitical sense, and of course with the invasion, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that became very, very clear, and that is a concern for the rest of the world, and particularly for China, because the U.S.-China tensions are high, and I think that might drive China into a certain direction that will be far less productive for the rest of the world. A broader reform of the monetary system is, however, is due. I mean, we have been struggling with this issue that that the U.S. is the dollar is the U.S. currency, but it's our problem for more than 50 years. So there has been some discussions on it in Washington, at the IMF, in the G20, and those fora. I think it's very important that despite all the geopolitical tensions, that those largely economic fora will continue to debate some of these issues and to find some of the solutions to prevent Mr. Rogers from making an awful lot of money out of it.
Mr. Rogers, your name is once again being mentioned, so go to you, Mr. Rogers, finally, for the parting shot.
When governments act, it is supposedly in their own interest, but back to Malaysia, in the last crisis, they closed off and closed their exchange rate. That was not good for Malaysia. The politicians at the time took short-term measures they thought would help, but it was bad for Malaysia in the end. I would have to say again, history is very clear to me that the more open an economy is.
What's going to be the responsibilities of investors?
Responsibility of investors?
Yeah.
That's why they invest.
And that's the only thing?
Well, I don't know what else you want them to do. You want them to build hospitals? Well, if they make money, many of them will build schools and hospitals, etc. But if you don't make money, you cannot do anything. You cannot do good. You cannot do evil. So investors have to make money first. And then, I mean, every economist in the history of the world knows that the purpose of investment is to build productive assets to help make money. And then after you make money, you can do anything you want. You can build all the schools in the world.
Thank you for reminding us the nature of capital, Mr. Rogers. So I want to thank all of you.
Wait, Terry, just a second. The nature of economics is not just any kind of economics. Even Karl Marx knew you had to have capital, and you had to build capital in order to have a successful economy and a successful society.
This is a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we're going to continue our talks on this. Lessons learned from 25 years ago. Today, we're facing different circumstances, but the danger could arguably even bigger. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Jim Rogers, Chu Chang, William Lee, last but certainly not least, Bert Hoffman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.